Hi there, I'm Doug. I wrote The Guardsman under the pen name of R.G. Taark. We are into the third book of the series. This is Wrath and Retribution. We are on episode 34. We're on chapters 80 and 81 today. Please sit back and enjoy. When you're finished, a like, comment, and subscribe would be awesome. And if you're really liking it and enjoying your time, the physical book can be found down in the description. Please sit back and enjoy. Thank you much.
The Guardsman, Book 3, Wrath and Retribution, Episode 34, Chapters 80 through 81. Chapter 80. Samson scribbled his name one last time into a stack of little form certificates congratulating the Academy's commencing third graders. His hand throbbed from the exercise. He still had his certificate, somewhere, packed away in storage that he had not had time to recall and unpack yet. He remembered how happy he'd been when he was that tiny and received his steadily larger certificate every year. He smiled wistfully down at the folder pining for those simple days, or even later simpler days when he could blow stuff up with impunity as the folder closed before his eyes. Bartholomew's crisply modulated voice and perfect dialect bobbed somewhere outside of his interest. Very good, sir. The third graders are out of the way. Now it's time for the second graders. A groan exploded from Samson's throat as he flexed his hand. Damn it, Mr. Grant. There are twice as many second graders as there are third graders. Grant spoke with so little inflection it sounded like he was sliding in sarcasm again. Indeed, sir. That is a peculiarity of the Guardsman Academy system. Every year there's half as many as the year before. Samson growled at the other man's smile. Damn it, Grant, don't patronize me. I'm not above punching you in the kidney and watching you roll around in pain while I giggle. Grant rolled his eyes as he leaned over to retrieve the folder. That wouldn't be very nice, sir. Then who'd get all this done for you to sign? Samson joked back, raising his hands theatrically. Peace, sweet peace in my office with no work to do. Uncowed, Grant retorted. I'd be back on my feet and do twice as much the next day. Samson threatened, almost pouting, I'll have to break your typing hand. The man was calling his every bluff and snapped back. I type equally well with both hands and/or one-handed. You'd hardly dent my production rate. Samson pulled the cap from the back of his heavily crafted wood pen and flipped the operating end around the upper grip of his hand so it spun horizontally a few times before he caught it, allowing him to hold it before capping it. Obviously, I'll never win this struggle against the cellulose tide. Bartholomew agreed. Indeed, sir, you will never win. No one in the history of the universe ever has. Decisively, Samson snapped the brass and wood pen together, covering the point. Then I'll get asymmetric on you. Suspicious, Grant demanded, How so? He flicked the pen and launched himself out of his chair with both hands, while the pen crashed into the mound of paperwork still crowding his inbox, while he exclaimed, I'll cheat. Grant groaned. Oh dear, here it comes. Thrilled with the possibilities, Samson said, Mr. Grant, I'm going to go play with my spaceship. Dumbfounded to the point of no longer using perfect delectation, Bartholomew asked, You're gonna what? Obscenely proud of himself, Samson declared, You heard me, mister. I'm going to go play with my spaceship. While clutching the third grader folder, Grant shook his head in confusion. Of course I heard you. You're right in front of me. I do have very good hearing. I have no idea what you mean, though. Samson happily strapped his sword onto his left hip and pulled his overcoat off the back of his chair. Once his hands dropped past the cuffs of his coat, he pointed straight up. I'm the Guardsman High Commander. It is my job to ensure that all guardsmen and our assets are maintained to an exacting standard that sets the standard for the rest of the hegemony to follow. Like a little dog who's finally come away with a bone, he smiled. I'm going out of the office on an inspection tour. Grant groaned as the fully scheduled day turned into a train wreck. Samson smiled at his unreturned enthusiasm. I signed a bunch of stuff for Warsong this morning. I know it hasn't left yet because I watched you put it on your desk, and you didn't leave the door enough time to close before you were back in here with that signature pile, so I know you haven't called for it to be picked up by courier yet. Grant groaned. You win, it's still there. Smiling, Samson said, Good. Give it to me. I'll take it up to them with me on one of the Home Guards dropships. Bartholomew overly patiently wondered, Sir, looking for an excuse to salvage the day, isn't that a little excessive? Feeling his out, Samson snapped, Hell no, Mr. Grant. Samson pulled his plain black overcoat tight, so it lay flat in the back as he stood, and then dropped it, so it fell back open in the front, showing his uniform underneath. I'm a general officer. That means that if I want to weasel out of signing a few thousand documents by performing my official duties in the form of an inspection tour, so be it. Bartholomew calmly needled Samson. I meant the dropship, sir. Shaking his head at the stupidity of the whole thing. Just the name. Drop and ship should never be in the same sentence, let alone the same word. It's counter to logic and grammar. It's an oxymoron. Why would anyone want to get onto a craft designed to fall out of the sky? With his own victorious smile firmly in place, Samson corrected, Mr. Grant, your well-executed delaying tactic is noted. I'm going to escape my office today. Resigned. Fine, sir. I'll arrange transportation. I'll tell them to have your ride standing by in 15 minutes. I'll calm you with the departure point. Samson nodded and walked out. True to his word, Samson received a calm message telling him the ship would touch down on the front lawn and depart as soon as he arrived. Samson took a family elevator up along the core of the building to the main atrium level. He passed through the usual flurry of gatherers, hangers-on, functionaries, and between meeting types. The hall was slightly muted given the chaos and shocks that had swept the hegemony's capital world over the last few months, but that was to be expected. It also was not every day that the new High Commander actually left his office, let alone was seen in public. They still gave him a wide berth as he strode easily through the crowd, with his left hand resting on his beautifully worked and solidly fashioned blade, leaving it to stand outside of the overcoat and behind him like a menacing tail. It was not the broken one, but was one of his old beautifully fashioned and utterly masterfully worked favorites he'd had specially retrieved for his use. The satchel of paperwork at the small of his back was invisible under his overcoat and sword. He passed equally effortlessly through the armed and armored Home Guards squad at the doors to the open lawn to the front of the citadel, while no one else was allowed to pass or even approach those doors. He easily returned the snappy salutes and continued his way to the dark gray dropship sitting with purring engines to his front right. The back ramp was down, and a full squad of armed and black-armored Home Guard was standing in a stiffly braced squad row formation past the far side of the ramp's landing, facing him while he approached. While he was still out of conversational earshot, but close enough to have heard parade ground commands, the squad as one knocked to attention and presented their weapons in salute like the perfect machine they were. Samson was slightly irritated with himself that he was so out of practice that he'd forgotten about the squad leader's ability to sub-vocalize commands through his helmet to the rest of his squad. He didn't let his personal irritation show as he snapped and dropped his own crisp return salute. followed by the squad ordering their own arms. He stopped at the base of the ramp, in front of the squad leader. He stared into the belly of the ship for a few blinks before he cocked his head to the right and asked, "Sergeant, is there a reason I should know about that has your squad kitted out and drawn up next to this ship?" The reply in crisp military cadence was beautifully familiar to Samson, who'd been too long without proper soldiers around himself. "Escort, sir." Samson reminded calmly, "Sergeant, I'm going to Warsong. I'm not invading another planet." The armored staff sergeant snapped enthusiastically, "We might get lucky, sir." Samson pinched his eyes shut while shaking his head, trying to muffle both the action and his sigh. Under his breath, he mumbled, "Crazy ass home guard." He looked over his right shoulder and watched the instant removal of the sergeant's smile at the old joke about their hard-earned reputation. Resigned to his fate, Samson allowed, "Fine, Sergeant, you all can come." He didn't even bother looking behind himself as he strode up the ramp. He knew they'd follow. In 30 minutes, they were landed in one of Warsong's hangars, where he left his overcoat and satchel in the dropship and had stripped the paperwork out of his satchel. He carried the paperwork in his left hand so he could salute with his right. He was greeted immediately at the base of the ramp by Captain Brockish's crisp salute. Captain Brockish was one of 5 Guardsman colonel equivalent ranking officers who were in direct contention for Samson's current position as High Commander before Samson had jumped all of his senior sub-colonel peers, and those other 5 higher ranking officers. Samson felt an intimidating flash of fear through his system as he realized that a Guardsman who was easily 15 years his senior had saluted him. Even Warsong's executive officer, a fast-moving sub-colonel equivalent, was easily 5 years Samson's senior in time of service. Suddenly he started to wonder if this was not such a hot idea as an escape route from paperwork. Samson flashed his own crisp salute as he strode down the ramp, dropped his, and watched as the captain and executive officer both dropped theirs in unison. He was not sure how to begin, as his last footfall left the dropship's ramp and fell to Warsong's deck. Captain Brockish saved him and started the conversation with a warm but professional smile. "Welcome to Warsong, High Commander." Samson accepted. "Good to be here, Captain." He wagged the paperwork in his left hand. "I come bearing gifts." The captain's eyes flicked down at the movement and recognized his paperwork. He spoke with dry sarcasm. "Oh joy, more paperwork." He questioned, "I usually receive them in courier distribution with our normal supply and material tugs. To what do we owe the honor, High Commander?" Samson smiled at the frank honesty and decided its mirror would be the best course of action with a direct and honest officer. "To the best reasons of all, Captain. I was buried in paperwork of my own and was looking for an escape route. I realized I'd never seen Warsong up close and personal. I decided to take a crack at it when I put 2 and 2 together and came up with 4. Samson continued to close the distance to a respectable handshake before handing off the paperwork and watching it get passed immediately to the executive officer. The captain realized the truth of what Samson said with a knowing and sly smile. "Fair enough." Samson watched his eyes flick up and narrowed at the movement behind him on the ramp, before he asked, "Brought friend, sir?" Samson rolled his eyes, one of Persephone's goofy sarcastic traits he'd picked up over the years, where only the captain could see the executive officer pulling and settling the paperwork into a manageable chunk. Samson spoke quietly. "They tagged along? Probably figuring I'd find 'em a war to play in, or something fun like that to do outside their normal security patrol routine." The captain chuckled at the home guard joke. He spoke calmly, Exec, the other officer looked up, and before he could answer the captain continued, make sure our guest home guard squad are fed and watered. I have some things I need to discuss with the High Commander. You have the ship. With an affirmative nod, the exec declared in crisp Navy speak, Aye, Captain. The captain smoothly dropped his left leg deeper into the hangar, extended his left hand to the depths of the cavern, and spoke clearly, This way, High Commander. With that Samson fell in on the right of the other officer, and they began the tour of Warsong's infinite number of twisting and convoluted corridors. There were no cardinal directions in space, only a vague recognition of front and back along with an agonizingly confused switch when he realized that the hangar they were in was actually facing from one side of the ship to the other, not front to back as his brain had presupposed. There were not many ways to see out the back of a dropship, and by the time he could see all he could see was the hangar anyway. Once that confusing direction flop was realized, Samson was completely lost in the identical navy gray corridors. They passed an infinite number of claustrophobically small corridors and tiny functional rooms packed with electronics and everything needed to run a large town or a small city in space. The weapon stations, ordnance storage lockers, bunk rooms, life support rooms, and bathrooms were pretty much all he really understood. The rest might as well have been alien. Samson realized entirely too late that he'd asked the wrong question when he was accosted in the engine room by the captain, encouraged by Samson's blank stare, as he started to answer Samson's offhand and poorly thought out faster than light engine question. Captain Brockish started to explain a second simpler time, as he called it, the FTL drive, by laying his hands flat with fingers opposing at Samson's eye level. This is the normal three-dimensional universe we live in, and our course between planets from start over here at my right wrist to the destination at my left wrist, wiggling both wrists to point out the locations while not breaking his fingers apart. Instead of traveling all that between the 2 points distance, we bend the space, arching his fingers and touching thumbs at a shorter distance, which is a really bad analogy for what we are doing because real space never changes. We just don't play by the rules for a bit. Shaking his head and continuing unabashed, by dropping out of normal space and traveling in a sort of quantum slurry. The result is that we maintain our integrity. We don't snap out of existence and pop into energy like an exploding soap bubble, and we travel along the shorter distance of my thumbs. The stronger and more finely tuned a ship's drives, the shorter the distance the drives can create, slipping his thumbs together so they overlapped in an ever shorter distance while never breaking apart his fingers that arched above and represented real space. Samson could tell that the captain was one of those people who would talk with their hands given the chance, as he visualized everything, especially complicated mathematical and practical concepts. The captain continued, After we create that shortened distance along my thumbs, like a straw or hose between the start point at my right wrist and the end point at my left wrist, we can travel that manufactured reality distance instead of the full arch of the real space represented by my fingers. He continued to babble as Samson stared open-mouthed at the fingers and thumbs suspended between the two men's faces. The only energy we expend is when we create the straw we are going to travel. Once it is created in the same instant, we use that energy like a powder charge on a chemical propellant bullet, which pushes a metal bullet down a rifled barrel. We basically coast down the barrel we made riding the wave of our own initial charge. Since we are skating along our little rifled barrel surrounded by the quantum slurry, we are in tune with the rest of the regular universe, so we don't get time dilation or the mass effects of the movement faster than light that should cause us to dissolve into a pure energy burst at the faster than light speeds of normal physics. The nice thing about it is that once it's open, We can move more than one ship in the same burst of energy, and we use the same efficiency as the ship that created the linking bridge. We effectively move as one and arrive in formation. When we exit, we are traveling at fantastic speeds for a brief moment. So we have the momentary shudder where the engines are transitioning. It's basically that time that we are slipping out of our own little sub-universe, represented by my thumbs, and dropping back into the real world that our transition is reconciled as speed while the manufactured universe dissolves, dropping out speed and the real universe keeps motoring along doing its thing. We never actually exceed our speeds, but we do have that translation period which makes a mess of things. That math gets really wild. But anyway, that creates a gravimetric distortion, that absurd faster than light relativistic speed while dropping out of transition that can be detected by watchers in the system where we are arriving. Scout ships are tuned to mitigate that. But they have about 5 to 15 seconds of calibration time we all experience before they are completely invisible again. Samson's mind felt soggy and slow after all the spaceship talk. He did manage to say, "Tommy said you would mention that." He mentioned it randomly in a conversation a few weeks ago. He said you were very proud of the fact that you discovered that you could track arriving scout ships, and you're causing his engineers to fit in the research division. The captain chuckled like a boy finding out he could play for longer with his favorite toy. "Well, I don't like those sneaky little bastards. They've always irked me. I spent a long time working it out. It's a tiny window to detect them, and you pretty much need several sensors in parallel, looking down converging paths to your approximated target arrival point. But yes, I finally figured out how to catch those sneaky little bastards." Samson chuckled back because that last statement was something he could understand. He asked, remembering something the captain had been very specific about, "Why did you keep saying it was like firing a bullet down a chemically powered rifle barrel?" Captain Brockish hesitated for a moment, playing his hands together and pressing some invisible sphere while he thought. "I think the easiest way to say it is that a modern pistol or assault uses pulses of energy down the barrel to expel the flechette. That's not the case in these FTL jumps. We are disrupted by energy and nasty complicated variable things like gravity and huge electromagnetic surges around stars. No one has ever proved it in an experiment and survived at least. But if there is a large enough blast in the path of a jump, like a nova or solar flare, at exactly the wrong time the ships will hypothetically, and according to the math, snap out of the line of the jump in the middle of the energy discharge and be smashed in the energy. Since they are moving so fast, the energy will break jump and the particles will be dense enough to act as a wall when compressed against the ship moving at the absurdly large relativistic speeds of jump distance before fully entering the real universe." Samson's jaw just hung open, brain not really grasping what he knew was just beyond the simplified explanation. Samson was not a stupid man by any stretch of the imagination. The basic academy graduate after 12 years carried equivalent schooling to have graduated with a 4-year university degree on top of those basic 12 years for a standard education. Basically, all their graduates were intelligent enough to handle graduating 4 years early from a university, to begin their careers as guardsmen, and he was beyond his depth. Changing the subject back to ship mechanics, he asked, "Do you actually understand the math to all this?" Captain Brockish barked a laugh in the middle of his engine room. Of course not. Samson could tell that was a gentle white lie. What do you think I have engineers for? The Guardsmen produce some of the smartest and finest soldiers in the universe. We have to send the good ones off to special schools for a few years after the academy, and at any given time we can only pull together 2 or 3 guys with the brains damaged enough to understand that quantum mechanics nonsense. They aren't even really guardsmen anymore. He was saying all of this loud and clear within easy hearing range of his entire engine room crew, with a huge smile on his face. They are more like engine room gnomes who are too valuable to send to other duties and never leave the engine room again. Guys who understand that stuff and can fix it are worth their carat weight in natural diamonds. Samson liked this officer. He had the right kind of damaged sense of humor that made working with and for him easy. But he also had that ability to communicate things to his soldiers in such a way that left them proud to serve alongside him and feel good about their jobs. He valued and respected his officers, since he only had officers on a Guardsman warship, and made sure they knew he appreciated them. He also took the time to explain things in such a way that he was not talking down to Samson while educating his new boss about the finer points of his ship. Samson made a mental note to pay attention to and learn from this officer. Chapter 81. Persephone silently cringed behind her empty fork, while she pulled it away from her mouth, and her mother tossed back the leavings of another glass of wine. Her eyes slipped to her right to look at Samson, while she pretended to look for the next bit of her salad. The meal was slightly out of order from what she was used to since they were dining in the old Earth continental style, where the salad came after the main entree. It was nice, but she suspected that her mother would not be remembering much of the meal, as long as it didn't involve violent retching where she could see what she ate for a second time in a few hours. Abigail was the next closest to Celine in the race towards inebriation. Abigail was slightly taller and thicker than the diminutive Celine, so she could absorb the alcohol better, and just because she was the closest didn't mean she was anywhere near as. Persephone had to think of the word that applied best to her mother, and the closest she came was hammered or totally smashed. The good news was that her mother was looking younger and less stress-racked than she had in years. Much of her old vivacious lust for life seemed to have returned over the last few days. She had always been the prettiest woman Persephone had ever known, but the dark clouds that had hardened her for so many years seemed to have moved off into the distance. She was actually smiling a very relieved and relaxed smile, that shaved 20 years off how she'd looked as little as 10 weeks before. It was almost like her watching the confrontation between Alexios and Samson had cracked the terrible burden that had been weighing her down for so many years. It was wonderful to see her smile again. Persephone remembered those particularly exciting and stress-filled days with an odd fondness until she stole a quick glance at Samson. The pointy toe of Persephone's shoe slammed into the back of Samson's Achilles tendon when she caught him and her father's major miming their stupid silent guardsman hand signals to each other about her mother again. Persephone silently corrected herself. Still was a better word than again. He jumped straight with a grunt. His bulging and pained eyes flashed to her, while Celine drained the last contents of another bottle of wine into her glass and placed the empty bottle with its two fellows. Persephone held the big dummy's eyes in her own long enough to push out a disapproving huff before locking his gaze firmly to his plate again. Samson's buddy, her husband's partner in crime for years, her dad's stupid major, busily scratched his nose feigning innocence. Abigail, Tomies, and her dad all snapped their eyes to Samson, so the sneaky, irritating man shirked half of the responsibility for their shenanigans, while the other three wondered what Samson had done. Celine babbled happily and obliviously about the wine and how they needed more bottles, which needed to magically appear on the table 10 minutes ago. Persephone huffed through her nose as her father's suck-up major quickly ordered another set of wine for her already swaying mother. Persephone finished her 5th glass of wine, managed to relax into her own autopilot state, and made it through her salad plate. The soft buzzing behind her eyes was interrupted by Abigail barking a laugh at something Celine whispered conspiratorially into her ear. The throaty grinding, sneezing sound that Abigail made when she slapped her hand over her mouth caused Persephone to roll her eyes at the two, before slipping her fork over the rim of her empty salad plate. Lord Philip King, of all he surveyed, was babbling over the women to Tomies at the other end of their small table, as they tried to talk about some silly speedball competition. Persephone felt a groan in her throat as she tried to stifle the conversation and revel in the pleasant calm she was feeling at the back of her eyes, thanks to her own drinking. Rolling her eyes over her salad plate was a much nicer diversion than thinking about work. Persephone felt a spike of rage flash through her brain as Abigail suddenly stood, and the fruit of her and her mother's heads together scheming was revealed. She snatched away Persephone's nearly empty bottle of wine before Persephone could snap out of her comfortable stupor and defend her territory. She barely managed an indignant sputter before Abigail drained the bottle into the 2 wine glasses at the far side of the table, neglecting Persephone's empty glass. Samson's gentle hand landing on her clenched right fist snapped her apoplectic rage as she settled back into her own seat with little more than a grumble. She felt herself float behind her eyes, detached from the world as she disengaged from Samson's hand, lifted her chair, and hiked its weight across the thick carpeting 3 times, so she could be closer to her mate before settling back into its comforting stability. That was not enough for her. Persephone felt the first wave of drunken dizziness as she reached under the table, scooped her legs with her left hand, and slipped her feet under her bottom so she could lean comfortably on her husband with her right shoulder. Lost in her own pleasingly slow thoughts, Persephone marveled at the sound of that, and thought over and over again to herself, "Samson is my husband now." She felt warm and safe leaning against his shoulder. She had always felt warm and safe with him, but now she didn't have to play any silly games or hide her feelings like she had for years, and that was a huge comfort. Her eyes dipped and dimmed repeatedly before her head snapped back up violently, causing her to look around at the room again, before repeating the process several more times. The conversation and evening jerked fast forward each time her head snapped vertically again over her shoulders. New bottles arrived, empties disappeared. Then she'd open her eyes and the bottles would be lower or empty. She was awkwardly measuring time in the disappearance of wine from other people's bottles. It was a strange measure, to say the least. Something her father said caused her to snap back to reality and focus on the conversation. "Not sure about that, Tomies. I still think that we need to do something about Rees." Tomies shrugged and flashed his standard informal smirk of disapproval that was reserved only for private conversations. Philip scoffed. "What's he gonna do, sue us?" Persephone's eyes flicked back to him, and she sluggishly recalled that it was her own name that had caused her to snap back to the conversation in interest. Tomies shrugged again and said easily, "He just might. He's got grounds. It's a big enough breach that is clearly our fault. He'll win if he fights. He'll win if he settles. Either way, we look like idiots. He wins monetarily, and we disrupt our ground force's chain of command by replacing him because of the conflict of interests with him in a suit against us. We lose 3 ways for the price of 1 contractual breach." Persephone's eyes blinked slowly of their own free will while her cheek and chin were firmly in place on Samson's shoulder and her right arm snugly, and more importantly, it was wrapped warmly, tucked behind his wonderfully solid left arm. Some small voice in her head wondered while she was looking at the settings in front of her father, "Is that the same glass he had when we started eating?" Daddy's only skimmed a little more than a third off the top of his wine. Persephone blinked without understanding at the irritating little voice spouting its sharp, pointy logic in her poor, happy brain. Persephone completely missed Tommy's admittedly juvenile gesture of shaking his head back and forth and rolling his eyes under the barrage of points that the two men had already discussed, but kept bludgeoning, hoping that somehow they would change with the repeated telling. Her mother and Abigail were back to conspiratorially whispering over the wine they had pilfered from Persephone's bottle. Or more accurately, the wine that she still perceived was the wine pilfered from her bottle. Persephone still smarted over that insult and vowed eternal revenge that she would work on when she felt like she could find the motivation to do anything at all other than sitting and cuddling at the dinner table. Persephone's left hand reached across her body, pushed and wormed into Samson's left pocket, while her right pushed his arm and shoulder forward, and her successful hand pulled his dinner silenced calm from his pocket. Her finger drunkenly only grazed the button's side and didn't activate the clock function she wanted on the screen. Until mildly frustrated, she rolled her finger over the button to make the contact. She groaned at the time and shoved the device back into Samson's pocket. Thanks to jackass Casimir and her having to root out his little insurrection, she had started her day sitting at her desk at 05:30 that morning, and had not left until her mother had ordered them all to break and meet for this late dinner. It was now just short of midnight, and they had been here in this small private dining room for a little over 90 minutes. They had filled that hour and a half with a nice light late evening supper and lots of wine. The girls had at least. The men had hardly touched a drop. Persephone, on the other hand, because of her general fatigue, was falling into inebriation faster than she could stub her toe in a dark and unfamiliar room. She loved hunting that rat bastard, Casimir. It was her burning purpose in life now to find him and make him pay for his entire myriad of crimes. That didn't mean that sleeping less than 4 fitful hours every night for the last many weeks, with that sleep plagued by the problems of assuming the traitorous maggot's desk as intelligence chief, made her life any easier. Instead, that burning passion had her up at all hours, either at her desk in the office or staring at her ceiling all night, thinking about the problems at hand and the all too few potential solutions. Add to that overwhelming fatigue the delirious mix of 5 strong glasses of wine, and Persephone wanted nothing more than to crawl up Samson's arm, turn herself around, and curl into a little ball in his arms, so she could cry herself to sleep against his warm chest while she listened to his heartbeat. At this point, she was so exhausted she didn't care if anyone saw her sleeping on his lap at dinner. Philip Kroinos, CEO of the Hegemony, retired High Commander of Guardsmen, and a dozen other exalted positions of enormous power grumbled. What a bloody mess, as he tossed the remainder of his glass of wine into his mouth and downed it all at once. Samson spoke, annoying and startling her partially awake. Consolidate and reorganize. Take the assets we have on the ground, pool them, and reshuffle the entire structure so we can cover all of our bases and responsibilities. The statement hurt Persephone's head, more irritating jargon and logic, and she was going to tell him as much until her mother cut her off, slurring sarcastically, "Ah, the adductor of my sweet innocent daughter speaks for the first time tonight." Philip looked from Celine as she fought valiantly to contain her sloshing wine and giggles. He ignored the comment as an escaped inner monologue, and instead, he asked Samson, "What do you mean by that? You sound like you have some plan rattling around in that head of yours." Celine interrupted again. "Oh, and you," poking her husband in the unyielding arm with her tiny finger, causing her whole body to sway fluidly against the recoil, while she smiled in drunken delight. Her speech slurred even more as she fought valiantly to be witty while drunk. "You Cro-Magnon. No, wait, not Cro-Magnon, you big ugly. Salamander lizard. Under rock living. Mud creature, it's all you fault my perfect little girl got. Hitched so fast, gotta get her a proper day. Philip calmly reached across the table for her glass. Celine, let's call it a night, okay? No more wine for now. Incensed that he would have the gall to reach for her precious red vintage, Celine recoiled violently, sloshing the contents of her glass so close to spilling over the brim onto Abigail that the much more sober woman jumped back halfway out of her seat to avoid the collision. With eyes wild and wide, and an enormous smile on her face, Celine jabbed back, Donna, you dare, Philip Kroinos, I will bite thy hand off, if you reach for my glass again. Philip huffed and rolled his eyes, but removed his hand. Celine was emboldened by her victory and sat upright in what only someone completely drunk could consider to be perfectly straight, and proudly pulled another sip from the glass. Philip pointedly looked away from Celine's playful mockery, and asked Samson again, What do you mean by that, Samson? You sound like you have something specific in mind. Out with it, boy. Celine playfully mocked with happy eyes and a giant grin. Oh yes, please do. We Wowl of Tea hear what the Cro-Magnon's cudgel has to say on the matter. Her nouns were all accentuated with her wine-slicked slur and amused interest. Before she could finish her playful teasing of Samson about stealing away her baby girl, Celine tried to raise the glass to her lips again. Instead, she caught the foot of her wine-glass on her empty salad plate, tipping the glass and spilling almost all of its remaining contents onto the plate. The architect and mastermind of thousands of flawless official dinners and state functions, the walking encyclopedia of manners and table etiquette, who corrected professional concierges who had the gall to be wrong in her presence, squeaked a very childlike, "Oops!" Persephone's jaw dropped when her mother dropped both arms below the table, still holding the wine-glass, and leaned forward to slurp the spilled wine out of her salad plate. Celine had always been death on her while growing up about sitting close to prevent spills, and especially about keeping her drinking glasses and food above and over the table at all times. Now she was not only holding a glass of red below the plane of the table, but sloshing red wine over the carpet, undoubtedly up to the brim of her glass. It didn't register with Persephone, but the men's jaws were all hanging slack in sympathy with her own. Abigail broke the silence with her friend. "Eve, Celine, you're disgusting tonight. You're so bad." Celine pulled herself upright and managed a semi-regal posture as she stuck her back and neck along the chair back to hold herself steady. She cupped the wine-glass, and its remaining finger's width of wine, in her lap as she calmly corrected her friend Abigail. "Now, Abby," her playfully patronizing voice was capped by her devilish smile. She didn't even bother correcting her slurring speech. "You know as well as I do that there are many combinations of disgusting, but we had red wine vinaigrette dressing with our salads. That means I'm perfectly fine, because I just made more dressing, and I's okay to finish your dressing." Tomies groaned and rolled his eyes at the thin excuse from the chuckling Celine. That groan earned him a pinched face from Celine that squished her cheeks and nose under her grimace. When Celine's playful menace receded, and her silence temporarily assured, because her wine-glass was firmly planted at her lips and she was busy trying to suck it dry, Samson spoke, "I think there is a simple solution to all of this." Celine scoffed by popping her lips and rolling her eyes as she finished the last drop of wine. Samson used her momentary mourning over her finished wine and the following silent sulk as she stared into her re-emptied glass to finish speaking. "Yes, sir, I think there is a solution. I think if we look at it like we were trained, we have all the assets on the ground, and we can just shuffle a few of them around and make ourselves whole again." Philip was intrigued. Celine was bored. Philip asked with more interest this time, How do you plan on doing that, Samson? And what assets are you talking about? Samson ran his right finger over that side's ear before he spoke. The family has lost 2 members, dead, discredited, disinherited, and disowned in order. One of those members had a spouse who he beat to within an inch of her life in an effort to kill her, so obviously he wanted nothing to do with her for some reason. And now we have Diantha down in the infirmary in her medically induced coma, so she can heal naturally, nothing we haven't already discussed. Her family wants nothing to do with her because they think she has disgraced them. Her family has publicly turned from her and stated she's not welcome because, right or wrong in their eyes, she has publicly embarrassed them. Casimir is without legal status since he is discredited and disowned, which means all his claims to rank, standing, and arrangements are null and void too. Diantha is without a husband and family, effectively a widow with only ties to this family. House Krynos is short 1 female to fulfill a matrimonial contract. Diantha is not legally married anymore. That arrangement was voided with Casimir's treason and exile from society. Persephone pulled back from Samson's shoulder like he had just slowly turned into some form of poisonous snake. Selene was quietly leaning both of her forearms onto the table, visibly wading through the alcohol-induced waves of nausea that pumped through her with every heartbeat, mentally chewing on what he had just said. Abigail was looking down and across at Tommy's, who was showing the first creeping signs of a smile. Philip leaned on his left elbow and propped his chin, while he stroked his lips with his finger, clearly seeing that Samson was aiming at something important. Even with her own drinking, Persephone could read in his eyes that he understood and had already made the connections. He asked anyway. When he spoke, it was with no heat and great interest. Out with it, boy. Spit out the rest of your plan, in plain English for me. I think I know what you are driving at, but it's been a very long week. Samson shrugged and simply said, "Adopt her." Selene groaned angrily, before charging her voice and firing at Samson. "I can't believe you would be so." She visibly derailed that escaped thought as she said it, and tapered off her tirade as her hands pushed her away from the table and snugly into the back of her chair. Her eyes flicked up to the ceiling and side to side as she visibly reasoned everything through in her mind, silently mouthing words as she ran a monologue to a conclusion inside her swimming head. Philip's eyes lingered on Selene, flipped to Samson, back to Selene, and finally down to settle on his now clasped hands as he leaned on the table over and around his salad plate. Philip spoke quietly into the now tomb-like silence of the dining room. "Adopt Diantha. We make her Persephone's younger sister. She retains Casimir's shares and picks up a chunk of Thanadio's shares contingently. If she is willing, we transfer the contract with Rhys to her. We counteroffer Rhys, heading off disaster for both sides with amiable terms, both sides more or less maintaining their honor, both sides get what we want and need, and there are no existing matrimonial entanglements." He was obviously referring sarcastically to Samson and Persephone eloping, followed by his own and Selene's acknowledgment of their common law status. He wondered philosophically at the relatively alien humanist aspect. "And we give Diantha a home either way, and we can possibly rebuild that young woman's life. Is that what you are suggesting, Samson?" Samson agreed. "Yes, sir." The CEO spoke thoughtfully. "I will have to spend some time tomorrow morning thinking about those particulars in detail." Philip nodded slowly. "And Samson?" Samson agreed again. "Yes, sir." The CEO shared casually. "For all intents and purposes, you are married to my daughter. You can call me Philip now. It won't kill you." Nonplussed, Samson agreed. "Yes, sir." Philip sighed in frustration. Some habits were harder to break than others. Celine slapped her hands to the table, pushing herself back while she announced, "Well, I'm done with my wine. Go 'ome, everybody. Time to asleep." Persephone took Samson's offered hand as he stood, and before she knew it, she was happily leaning against him again. Celine stood too quickly and toppled into Abigail's waiting hands. Abigail gently reminded Celine, as Philip joined her in standing Celine upright, "Careful there, Celine." Persephone folded into Samson as they turned to walk for the door, and she ended up kicking his feet several times on the way to the door. She was so tired she could hardly stand or keep her feet in time. Added the effects of a whole bottle of wine herself on top of her fatigue, and her body moved like a soggy dishcloth. Samson suddenly stepped back, leaving her momentarily confused before he scooped under her legs to carry her instead of wasting the effort trying to coordinate with her stumbling steps. Philip worked on settling Celine into a manageable position while Celine catcalled after them, "Go make grandbabies for me to play with." Persephone didn't hear her between the sound of the opening door and falling asleep on Samson's shoulder before the door closed.
Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate your listening. When you get a chance, please come and hit the like, subscribe, leave a comment, and check out the book for real down in the description.